So we drained it. We'd made some of it into houses. We'd taken our nice stream that was that greenish line there. We made it into a concrete straight line channel to drain out this area. We'd taken the water. We were using the water for Miami's water supply. This is kind of a recipe for disaster for the animals living in the Everglades. In 1947, Congress created the Everglades National Park to protect some of the portions of the Everglades, but it only protected about 20% of the original size of the Everglade. So about 1,250 square miles were protected from this. And it could only protect the southern region of the Everglades. The northern regions had been too impacted by development in order to set them aside as a national park area. There were houses and other things and agricultural lands there as well, so you can't really convert that easily to a national park. They had to figure out how to fix the water flow, though, because you'd lost a lot of the natural river pathways because we'd created all of these ditches and lined them with concrete. We'd created a canal system. Have you ever seen what happens to a river when it's left alone? So if that's our river, over time it's going to shift some. It might end up changing a little bit. It could change a lot. Sometimes what will happen is that during flooding time it actually will cut off and run straight in an area. But the area where the river is going to move through is called the floodplain. These are the areas that are frequently flooded, yes, but they're also the areas where you see a lot of depositional sediment from flooding and a lot of movement of where the water is. I worked at the Stroudwater Research Center in Avondale, it's out in Chester County, when I was a postdoc. And they have an area of stream there where they have not affected it, where they've kind of let it move as it wants over the area. They have, usually about every year, they will put stakes out on where the edge of the river is on each side. So you can see a multi-year movement of what the river channel looks like. And it's interesting to see that at some points it was over here, and now it's here, and that things have filled in and that it has moved. That movement is normal. It's natural. It's part of the system. But we did away with that when we created this canal system. So suddenly, you have to take these canals and restore water flow. How do you think we do that? So suddenly what we now have is this straight line. How are we going to get natural water flow back?
It has like concrete liners and at least take those out first.
Or at least crack the sides of the concrete liners to get the water to move out of it. You can use heavy machinery and you can dig a new pathway. And that's part of what they did, and start flooding it again and changing water flow. It means you're also going to have to increase the water that's coming down. Because if you're still using as much water at the northern regions, there won't be much water coming down south. So they had to change how people were using water. They did reestablish some natural flow from Lake Okeechobee through the marsh. But you don't get the same exact water pathway back that you had before. So that blue line that's on there now might be what it looks like when you reestablish flow. It's going to be different than it was because you can't quite mimic the same thing because you've done away with it. So in restoration, you can't always get back exactly what you had, but you can get something better than what you have currently. And that's kind of the point of restoration here, is to get it back to a healthier, more natural ecosystem. Do you think it worked? National Park Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, the Audubon, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, believe it or not, and local groups got involved with helping with restoration. The restoration process took about 30 years of time to go through the restoration process. If you remember last time when I talked about restoration, I said that we need to be careful about how we monitor it and careful about how we set our goals. Because if you were to say, okay, well, we're going to have restoration complete in 5 years, that might not be possible. This process took about 30 years to restore it. In 1989, they'd restored enough of it. They realized that in order to get it back to healthy, they were going to have to expand. So they passed the Everglades National Park Protection and Expansion Act that added 2,300 more miles squared back to the Everglades. So it's not quite the 5,000 that it was before, but it's more than 30% of the way back to normal. They did this for one main reason: water flow. They weren't getting the significant water flow that they needed through the system. So in order to get more water, they needed to include more of the area of the Everglades, which meant less water that had been diverted for human use. And then in 1996, Congress limited the sugarcane industry in Florida, which allowed for more area to be turned back to national parklands. And it would keep them then from redeveloping the same area for sugarcane. The Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan was passed in the year 2000 at a cost of $7.8 billion.
Does sugarcane do well out west? Needs dry soil, or is that too dry?
It's usually too sandy and too hot. So you need drier soil, but you still need that humid-ish climate. So it's a little bit too dry there. But that's one thing we could do, is try to find drought-tolerant crops that we could grow out there. And with growing foods in Arizona, what's currently being recalled? Romaine lettuce from Yuma, Arizona, from E. coli contamination. So there's lots of reasons perhaps why we shouldn't be growing lettuce in the desert. More now than normal. How much did it cost to destroy the Everglades? Does anyone remember? 30 million. It's now costing more than 8 billion in the end to repair it. So this brings up another concept that we've talked about this semester, that idea of prevention versus cleanup. Remember I told you prevention might be expensive, but cleanup in the end is always more expensive, and that is true here. Fixing an environmental problem that we caused is usually going to cost a lot more than if we had stopped it from happening in the first place. The purpose of the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan was to restore, protect, and preserve the ecology of the Everglades. Like everything else, it focused on restoring water flow. Until you have the right water flow, you don't have the right wetland environment to support the animals there. So with yesterday's wetland delineation lab, what everybody told me is that water is foundational. But you also told me you don't get a wetland by pouring water on it. That you have to have the right soils, the right animals, the right plants to get a wetland that's healthy. And hopefully one of the things you've noticed this semester is when we talk about ecology, we're not just talking about the biology. The soils, the waters, everything that makes up the ecosystem is important. The biology is impacted by all of that. And to get this healthy, this is showing about the restoration project in the Florida Everglades. So you can see here what the historic conditions were like for water flow, what it was currently at that point in time, and what the expectation was for when we restored it. So water flow had been greatly diverted in order to get the water to Miami. And we had to figure out how could we take time to restore it. Because you can't restore it all at once. You would have had some flooding issues that probably would have destroyed ecosystems that were healthy. So you have to do it step by step as you move through. There are still some problems with restoration of the Everglades. Like every area where we've taken a natural ecosystem and made it into farming land and made it for other uses, there is some excessive nutrient loading. There's a lot of farming. There's still a lot of golf courses in Florida. And these areas that have been used for farming fields that have been turned back into areas of wetland have excess fertilizer, which is leading to eutrophication. That extra nitrogen, extra phosphorus leads to higher amounts of algae, lower dissolved oxygen. The habitat here has been destroyed. Some's been lost, but a lot has been fragmented. And when you fragment, remember, you create more edge and less interior of a habitat. When you have more edge, generally speaking, it's less healthy than it was to begin with, and it's more prone to invasion from invasive species. What is typha? It is a type of plant. Does anyone know what it is? I'll grab you a picture of it. And then I'll see if you can figure it out. What is typha?
Cattails.
Cattails. Typha, as an invasive plant, is probably going to make you all really mad. But in some places, typha is invasive. Cattails can become invasive in some ecosystems. Typha has been a big problem for the Everglades because that was not one of the main species that made it up originally. It was a lot of grass species that were there. And when typha and other reed species become established, they can outcompete grass species. So that has been one of the problems, is that as this area has been restored, it's also tried to rehabilitate the ecosystem. The ecosystem tries to rehabilitate itself by spreading out on the new area. The things that spread out first and best are your invasive plants. So they're trying to remove typha while restoring the native species to it.
Like, how do they convince companies to do that other than by trying to explain to them the loss of habitat?
Part of it is tied up in the loss of the large animals. It's easy to get people to spend money on caring for the Florida panther. It would be less easy to get money to spend on American alligator, but you can use people's fears of alligator. If we have habitat for the alligator, then it's not going to be in your backyard. So sometimes we use animals as a thing to get them to care because it's easy. Let's just think for a moment. How many of you care more about animals than you care about plants? Everyone. How many of you care about plants more than you care about bacteria? So we also don't sell restoration project based on the bacterial community. We sell it based on the things we're going to get people to care about. And then sometimes companies use this as a tax write-off. If you're talking to companies, I have donated money to blah cause, and it works. They're allowed to donate to causes. They're allowed to do restoration work. Sometimes companies that have caused the problems are forced to, not for restoration usually, are forced to pay for it. But let's say that Cody owns a company. I'm going to pick on you, Cody. And he destroys a wetland. He's not allowed to, but he does. If they have to then restore a wetland on that area because he broke the law, he's going to have to pay for it. This didn't involve breaking any laws, which is why the federal government is kind of on the hook for this. But how many of you want to visit the Everglades and see a Florida panther or an American alligator in their natural habitat? This is another way we get people to, in the local communities, to think this is a good use of money. Tourism dollars. The money that they're going to get for people coming to see the Everglades, healthy, is so much more than if it's a ecosystem that is not healthy. So we will use things like that. It will also decrease flooding. So the idea that it will cost less for flood insurance in areas where it's even possible to get it, that it will reduce flooding anyway so that there's going to be less flooding. All of these things work into making it a good package for people to think is important. But we have to talk in the right terms. If I talk about restoring the Everglades as a way to help saw grass, people aren't going to care about sawgrass. But when I say that it's also going to restore the wood stork population, it's going to help endangered species, they're going to care a lot more. Does that make sense? For some of you, this is really kind of difficult to say, but we should do it because it is good, not because I've got a 15-step plan of why it is good. But you need that plan when you're talking to the government or when you're talking to constituents, because some congressmen had to answer to their constituents, not the ones in Florida necessarily, but the ones in Wisconsin. Well, why is that a good use of my tax dollars? We also need systems like this where we spent the money on them to be able to prove that restoration is possible. And when you have proof of concept, people are more willing to spend more money on it for other systems. Has anyone heard of the Kissimmee River? It was your main river here in the Everglades. You heard of it, Hannah? You were down at Disney World? It was channelized in the 1960s. This was a river that was about 166 kilometers long, and we made it then 90 kilometers long because we made it a straight line. And we condensed it all down into a 100-meter wide channel. This resulted in a wetland loss of 65% along the Kissimmee River, just from constructing water flow. If you want to make this healthy, you had to restore what's called the sinuosity of the river, so the curvature of the river. Because you've all been near streams. How many of them are straight lines? No. Nature doesn't work well in straight lines because they're going to move, they're going to flow. And as you have a flooding situation, if you have a lot of water flow, one area of the water is going to cut deeper than the other. It's going to cut a curve into it. The other area is going to have more deposition. It's going to have less of a curvature to it. It took a lot of time to get this back to looking like normal. But it required, as they did that, restoring the wetlands, restoring the riparian forests next to the wetlands, next to the streams, and providing places where there were plants that were good at handling excess nutrients, which is why some of the invasive plants thrived here. Many of our invasive plant species do really well under eutrophic conditions because they're capable of getting in and handling. In the end, you had a lot of areas where you may have partially restored it by adding some curvature back next to the channelized system so that you could increase the size of it, allowing the water to find new pathways over time.